So the Transtheoretical model is quite a well-known model for describing the way that people change any behavior. The idea is that people don't just one day decide, I don't like exercise, and then the next day do it. That it happens through this continuous and back and forth process where sometimes people move a little bit forward and sometimes people move a little bit back, and that people spend a long time thinking about something before they actually start to do it. So the model identifies these different stages, there's 5 of them, how people move and what sort of strategies might apply at the different stages. So the first stage is called pre-contemplation because it's before they've even contemplated changing the behavior. This is the smoker who doesn't see it as a problem. This is the majority of the population who doesn't necessarily see their sugar intake as a problem. This is someone who doesn't even consider watching Doctor Who. This can apply to anything, and I'm pre-contemplative for Doctor Who, really. I haven't even really thought about it. Well, yeah, I haven't. I've ruled it out. So at this stage, the con of whatever behavior it is, be it Doctor Who or exercise, significantly outweighs the pros. People can identify all these reasons why it would be a bad idea, and they struggle to come up with reasons why it would be a good one. And they also don't necessarily have a high level of self-belief that they could change anything, even if they wanted to. And those things tend to go together. Although at some point, people generally do start to think about a behavior. Something happens, whatever it is, and we'll talk about that later, but something happens that gets them to start thinking they might change. So contemplation means they're thinking they could change sometime in the next 6 months. There tends to be kind of equivalent pros and cons at this point. And whenever there's like equal pros and equal cons, people tend to stay the same. There's this stagnation that happens and we have this inertia. But what happens at this point is people are kind of weighing up whether they change or whether they don't, but they also don't necessarily believe that they can because they haven't started doing it yet. At some point, people who end up changing usually go through a stage of making plans to change without actually taking action on it. This is called the preparation stage. You might start to join a gym where you haven't started exercising yet, or you start buying the equipment even though you haven't used it yet. All of these things are preparation stages without actually doing it. And at this point, generally the pros are starting to outweigh the cons, but because you haven't actually started doing anything yet, self-efficacy tends to be low. The action stage is when you start doing the behavior. You start to change the way you're cooking, or you start to actually exercise, and you have your first day in the gym. This is the action stage. At this point, usually the pros outweigh the cons, which is why you've started. You start to develop some self-efficacy, but it's also a really volatile stage. A lot of people join the action stage in January and then they very quickly regress back to contemplation. Any process of regressing from one stage backwards, from going from action to preparation or preparation to contemplation, is called relapse. And this isn't so much of a stage as a process of moving backwards. It's really common that people relapse, and it often does lead to a lowering in self-efficacy because people go, I tried and I failed, and it adds to the evidence that they can't change. However, if some people make it through the action stage and get to this idea called maintenance, that's where they've kept up a habit for about 6 months. At this point, the pros way outweigh the cons, otherwise they would have stopped, and their self-efficacy is usually quite high. This is where we want most people to get. We want them to get to a point where they've held on to a behavior for 6 months, at which point it's probably become a habit. So this process can take months or years. It can take a really long time to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, or from contemplation to preparation. And once you get to preparation, there's no guarantee that you're not going to relapse back to pre-contemplation. We know change takes a long time, but it doesn't necessarily have to. I go through these 5 stages once I get out of bed every morning, the same way as these puppies. You can see that this little fella is contemplation. He's thinking about getting up, but he's not super committed. This little guy, he's in preparation. He's yawning, he's stretching, he's ready to get up. Old mate down here is in action, he's out of bed. And then we've relapsed back to pre-contemplation here, who's fallen completely asleep. So if you look back at the whole model, there tends to be this change that happens as you move along the processes. One is that you get this increase in self-efficacy as people start to take more action. That makes sense. But you also get this outweighing of the cons by the pros. As people start to take action, their beliefs start to change and they become more committed to that behavior. I don't necessarily think just being able to describe the stages is of much use. The thing that the Transtheoretical model adds isn't just the stages of change, but the processes of change. So it hypothesizes different processes of change at each point along the way. So to give you a good understanding of what these different processes are, I'm going to explain them and then provide an example and try to get you to choose which one we're describing here. So let's first explain 2. The first one's called consciousness raising, which involves basically, like in the health beliefs model idea, providing education about the pros and the cons of a certain behavior. In consciousness raising, it would include providing some information about the risks of not changing your smoking, for example, but also might include the benefits of changing. So it's basically a type of education where you're trying to bring into the consciousness of the person some of the ideas and the pros and cons to try to help change that decisional balance. But there's one other way to try to not touch the head as much as touch the heartstrings, and that's called dramatic relief. Dramatic relief usually does involve trying to create some fear, an emotional response, or at least some kind of gut-wrenching feeling that if I don't change this, something really bad will happen, and it hits those emotions. Or if I do change this, something really hopeful and amazing could happen. And that's, again, another emotional response. So consciousness raising is more up here, and again, dramatic relief's a little bit more in the heart. So what I want you to do is have a watch of this ad and see which one of these do you think it is.